Now let's get started with templates. So if we go back to our code, this is our views file. Till all this while we have been using a simple HTTP response object. But as you know, the web pages can be much more complex. A web page can have a lot of data to render, or it may have some other complex structures like forms which we need to handle. So in all of those cases, it's much convenient to create your regular HTML templates. And as you can guess, Django supports all of this templating language. In fact, Django has its own inbuilt templating language, and which is normally referred to as Django templates. It's a regular HTML file, but just the way that you write the file slightly differs, and I will show you how all of those things work. So let us go back to the documentation, and let us start with the first thing, that is by creating our templates. And I want you to notice this path over here. So we have our polls application. Inside of the polls application, they want to create a directory for templates. And again, inside this directory of templates, they want to create another directory by the same name, polls. And finally, inside of this, we create our template by the name of index.html. You must be wondering, why do we need so many folders inside another folders, or why do we need another folder called as polls inside templates? So normally what happens is, whenever Django wants to load its templates, it's going to scan your application from to the top to the bottom. And in case instead of polls we have another application, maybe like a blog or a contact, and inside of that application we have another file called as index.html. So at that time Django gets confused. Should Django use the index from the polls application, or should Django use the index from the blog application? So in order to avoid this confusing situation, what we do is we simply create a folder by the name of application inside templates, and that's where we house all of our templates. So let us go back to our code editor. Let me open up my sidebar. So this is our polls application. Here I create a template folder. Inside of this, again I create another one by the name of polls, and inside of polls I create a file which is of the name of index.html. Now let us go back. Let me scroll a little bit down. Now what these guys have done is, they have first given the code and then we have the view for it. So let us do the same thing. First let me just copy from the index.html, and then when we write the views file, at that time I will be able to explain what's happening inside the template. So I just go over here, just paste all of this. Now let us go back and let us have a look at the view. Here they are doing a couple of things. So the first thing is they are importing a loader from our Django templates, and then they create a template right on this line, and finally it gets rendered right over here. So let us go back to our code editor, and where we can write all of these lines one by one. So let me close this. Let me collapse my sidebar, and on the top first let us try to import. So I can say from Django.template I want to import my loader. Now let us go to our views of index. Here I don't need this line, so let me take it out, and let us create a variable called as template. And here we can say that from the loader I want you to get the template, and here we need to specify the path. Let me just open up my sidebar. So by default Django always looks inside the folder of templates. That's the way how Django is coded. But remember, we need to be specific. We have created another folder by the name of polls inside templates. So inside this code over here, we need to be specific, and we can say that I want you to go inside the folder of polls, and there you can find the file of index.html. The next thing what we can do is, let us create another variable by the name of context, and this is going to be a simple dictionary. Let us write the key over here, and what I'm going to do is I want to name my key as latest question list, and I want to assign the value of latest question list to this one. And finally inside our response we can say that template I want you to render. Then let us pass our variable of context, and then let us pass the request. Let us go back to our server and check if it is running or not. Let me click on the link and let us navigate to the right URL. So as you can see, everything is working. Now let us go back to the code editor and try and understand what's happening with our templates and our views. So again, let me split my screen and let me open up my index.html on my right, and on the left I have my index view. So if you check your index.html on the right, you can see that we have very special syntax right over here. So these are called as your code blocks. So they are with your open and closing curly brackets, and then we have the % symbol inside of these things. So what happens is whenever Django runs your HTML file, it actually parses all of your file, and these code blocks are actually replaced by valid HTML data. So if we go back to our web page, and if I just right click and if I click on view page source, we can see that what Django has done is it has actually created two links and two anchor tags, and it has injected the code inside. Now let us go back to our code editor. So what Django did was, you can see this block over here. So all of these code blocks were replaced by Django, and Django injected all of the HTML code. Now let us try and understand what's happening inside our index.html file. So the first line, we are saying that if latest question list. Now from where is this variable coming? So if you go to the left to your function of index, you can see that, let me slightly zoom out. Sorry, I need to zoom out. Here we can see that we have created a variable called as context, and the key is latest question list. So what Django is doing is, if you see on the right, this variable comes from your context on the left. If you want, you can also change the name of this variable. So this can simply call as latest question. But if you change the context name, then it has to also reflect in a template. So this becomes your latest question, and this also becomes your latest question. But for the sake of convenience, let us go back to the old naming convention. Here it is. Let me save it and let me zoom back inside again. So again, a small recap. The brackets, the curly brackets and the % are your code blocks, and here we have this variable latest question list. This is coming from the context. Oh, I need to change right over here as well. So this variable inside our template is coming from the context data. Now let us go to the next line, on line number 2. On line number 2, you can see that we are creating an unordered list. And if we go back to our web page, we can see that inside our page source, we can see that we have an unordered list. Now let us go back to the code. On line number 3, what we are doing is we are creating a regular for loop inside our template. Just as you would create a for loop inside Python, the same way you are going to create a for loop inside our Django templates. So if you see, the syntax is very familiar. So the syntax says that for question inside my latest question list. Now, what is the type or what is the data inside this variable? So again, let us go back to the index. And if you see on line number 10, we have the data right over here. Latest question list is the type of our query set of questions. And that's what we are passing it right over here on line number 14. So here it is. We are assigning the value of latest question list to the key of latest question list. All right. Now let us go back to the index. So now what's happening here is that we have a for loop. And for each iteration, what we want to do is we want to create a list item. And inside the list item, we want to create an anchor tag. Now, if we go back and check the source code, here we can see that yes, Django has created two list items, and that's because we have two questions in our database. The first one, the title or the question text is Python is easy to learn, and the second one is simply what's up. So let us go back. So till line number 6, what we have done is we have created an unordered list and we have dynamically inserted the list items. And for each iteration, let us see what we're doing. Let me go back to my full screen so that's much easier for us to understand. So this is our file. So what we are doing is for each iteration inside our for loop, we are creating a list element, and inside the anchor tag, you can see that we are injecting data dynamically. Again, this open and closing curly brackets are Django specific. So what Django is going to do is for each iteration of your question, it is going to replace this variable by the actual question ID. Now, if you go back to the web page, you can see that we have polls/2. So this 2 is the question ID of this one. And for WhatsApp, the ID is number 1. So this data is being generated and injected by Django dynamically. And inside our anchor tag, we want to have the question text. And that's what is also being rendered inside our HTML template. Now, if we go back to the web page, so this is what finally gets rendered on our browser. Now let us go back, and the next part is right over here on line number 7. So if we are saying that if we don't have any of the latest question list, at that time I simply want you to render a paragraph tag which contains no polls are available. And finally on line number 6, we are ending our if statement. And as you can see, this syntax is specific to Django templates. So this is also called as your Django templating language. It's very similar to your regular Python, but with a slight twist. Now let us go back to our views file. So let me close the index.html. I don't need it. Yes, I want to save everything. And this is our views file. Now what we can do is, instead of creating a template and then calling to render it, Django actually gives you a much more convenient feature. So let's see how we can explore the little shortcut. So here what I can do is I can say that from my Django.shortcuts, I want to import render. Now let us go down, and here I don't need this line, so let me take it out. And here what we can do that instead of creating an response object, we can simply call the function of render. The first parameter is your request. The second one is the name of the template. Now remember, we have to be specific, so we have created a folder called as polls, and inside of that folder we have index.html, and the third variable is actually the context or the data that we want to pass to our template. And since we have the variable called as context, that's what we are passing right over here. So this variable that we created, we are simply passing that variable inside our render function. Now let me save the file and let us go back to our browser, and if I refresh the page, everything is working just as fine. Now let us go back to the documentation. So this is where we saw how to use the template variable and how to use template.render. Now if I go slightly down, here they are explaining how to use the render function. So we just saw this one as well. Now let us try and scroll a little bit down. Okay, so this is important. Now what happens if we don't have a valid question inside our database? So at that time we actually need to raise an error called as 404 error. You must have seen this error very frequently on other websites, and we need to handle this situation as well. So let us go back to our code editor and let us import. Here I can say on line number 1, I also want to import my HTTP 404 error. Now let us go right over here. Here what we can do is, oh sorry, I think they're talking about the details view. Let me confirm. Yes, so they're talking about the details view. So what we can do is inside our details view, here we can create our try and catch block. So we can say first try. Let us see if we can find the question or not. So let us create a variable called as question, and then we can use the database API. So we can say that question dot objects dot get and I want you to get by my ID, or you can also write as primary key. You can use anything that you want, and my primary key should be my question ID. So remember, this question ID is coming from the function definition right over here, and this is coming from our URLs. So the next thing is, in case if we are not able to find the question, so at that time we can use an except block. Here we can say that from my question I want to check format does not exist. So in case we don't have the question, at that time we have to raise and HTTP 404 error, and we can say that question does not exist. And if everything is working fine, then what we need to do is we simply have to render. The first one is the request. The path would be your poll/detail.html. The third one is our context or the data that we want to pass. So let's create the key and value pairs right over here. So we can say that the key would be my question and the data that I want to pass is the question. Let us save the file and let us go back to the documentation. So we have finished all of this code, but it's not going to work because we don't have the details HTML page as of now. So let us scroll a little bit down, and here they are saying that let us create the details.html page inside our polls application. So again, this is the path, and we have just one line of code inside our HTML template. So let me just copy this. Let us go back to our code editor. Let me open up my sidebar. Now remember, we are inside our polls application, inside templates, inside the folder of polls. Here I need to create another file by the name of detail.html, and let us paste the code right over here. So this is just a single line of code. Let me collapse my sidebar, and if I go back to my views file, again the name of this variable or the name that we give inside the key and the name that we reference inside the templates should match. That's why here also we have a question, and on line number 23 here also we have the question, and the data that is being passed is right over here, and this data we are getting on line number 20, which is right over here. Now let us go back to our browser. Let us go back to our application. Let me first refresh my page and then let me click on this one. So our details HTML file is also working. We get this output, and if you go back to the code, that's what we are rendering. We simply want to render the question. Now remember, let me open up my models, and inside our class of model we have a dunder_str method. So whenever we want to display the question, just the question text is being rendered, and since in our case the question text is Python is easy to learn, that's why that is being rendered whenever we call the details view. Now let us go back to the documentation. So on the next line they are saying that we also have a convenient shortcut called as get object or 404. So let us go back. Let me collapse my sidebar. I don't want the models. I don't want the details file as of now. So this is our views file. Again, let me go to the top, and from Django.shortcuts, let me import another function called as get object or 404. Now let us go back to our details view. Here what we can do is we can replace all of these things by the convenient function that we just downloaded. So here I can say that my question would be my get object or 404. The class is the question, and the arguments is my ID should be equal to my question ID, and that's it. Now if you go back to our browser, let me go back to the application, let me refresh. So everything is working fine. Let's go back one more page. Let us click on WhatsApp. So this is also working fine. So what we did is we simply replaced all of the lines with a single function that we imported from Django itself. And the first argument was the model that we wanted to query for, and the second parameter is by which parameter we wanted to query. And since we wanted to query our database by id, we simply pass the key value pair right over here. Now let us go back to our Django documentation and let us see what's happening next. So here they are showing that how we can work with our Django template. So again, let me copy this code. Let me go back to my code editor, and what I want to do is I want to open my details.html, and let me replace the single line with the new code. Now let us see what's happening. Now remember, we have a question, and on the first line we have created our h1 tag. And remember, these curlies are your Django templating language syntax, and the data that we want to render is we want to go to the model of question, and we simply want to render the question text. When we have this two open and close curly brackets, that means that we simply want to display the data. And when we have the curly bracket followed by %, that means we actually want to run the data, and then we can do something with the data as we are doing on our line number 4. So again, on line number 3, we are creating the for loop, and this is your regular for loop. And what we are doing is we simply want to query for the choice. Now this choice is coming from our model of question. Now remember, inside the model of question, we saw how to access the choice set, and that's what we are doing right over here. And for each iteration of the choice, we simply want to create a list item, and inside the list item, we just want to display the choice text. So again, let me repeat, we simply want to display the data. That's why we have two open and two close curly brackets. And here we have the curly bracket and the %, since we want to actually run the for loop. And on line number 5, we are closing our for loop. And finally, at line number 6, we are also closing our unordered list. Now let us go back and let us go back to our application. Let us go back and let me click on Python is easy to learn. So here you can see that now the text is bigger, and if I again right click and then if I go to the source, we can see that we actually have an h1 tag. Let me slightly zoom inside for you, and this h1 tag is coming from here. So here you can see that we have an h1 tag. That's why we have an h1 tag right over here. And since we have not created any choices for this question, that's why we don't have any choices right over here. Let me close this one. Let me close this one. Let us go back and let us click on WhatsApp. So yes, this time we have two choices. The first one was not much, and second one was the sky. Now what we can do is we can slightly jump ahead of the documentation, and in case if you're wondering from where this came, or if you want to create your own choices, let us do one really fast shortcut. Let us go back to the polls application, and inside the admin, let me collapse my sidebar, and on line number 3 we can also import choice. And let's do one thing. We can again say admin.site.register, and I want to register my choice as well, because I don't remember if I had created these choices on screen or offline when I was testing my application. But now since we have added this choice to our admin app, we can simply go to the admin. So what I can do is I can go to the admin. Let me put my username and password. You can see under the section of polls, we have two different tabs. So one is for choices and the second one is for the questions. So let me click on choices, and here let us create some more choices for our question number 2, that is Python is easy to learn. So here we can say that the question is Python is easy to learn, and let's say the choice is yes, Python is easy, and let's save and add another. Let's again choose the same question, and here we can say neither. Let us again add one last one, and here we can say as simply no, and let us click on save, and let us go back to our site. Let us go back to our URL of polls. Now since we have added choices for the question number 2 as well, let me click on this, and this time we have the choices. Python is easy to learn, yes, neither, or no. and all of this data is being dynamically rendered from our template, which is right over here. And you can see that since we have added three choices, we have three choice text on our web page. So again, if I just right click and if I go to my page source, here you can see that we have three list items, and these are all your choice text that we just created. All right, so let me close this one and let us go back to the documentation. Let us try to scroll down and let us see what's happening. So the next part, they're saying that we have some hard coded URLs inside our templates, but we can do a much better job by using another Django template specific syntax, and that is by using the URL. So let us go back to the code editor. Let me first close all of these files which I don't want. Let me open up my sidebar. Now inside my templates, I want to go to my index.html. So here, as you can see that this is the hard coded URL. Now in future, what happens if you change the URL? Instead of writing polls, we wanted to go to the root path and something like this happens. Then we need to go to all of the templates and we need to change the hard coded URL from all of the templates, which could be much error prone. But what we can do is we can simply use the Django syntax. So let me show you what it is. So here I can open and close my curly brackets. I can put my person symbol saying that this is going to be my Django syntax. I don't need the quotes. And here we have to be specific. We want to say that we simply want to invoke the function of URL. And if you remember, we have given the names to our URLs. So again, let me open up my sidebar. And if I go to my URLs, here we can see that for the view of details, we have given the name as detail. So this is what we are going to refer inside our HTML template. So again, let me close this one. Let me collapse my sidebar. Here I can say that I want to access the specific URL of my detail. And if you remember, just go back to your URLs of details. So this is your URL of detail. Now what happens is for this URL, we also need to pass the question ID. So we need to be specific inside our templates as well. So again, let me go back to the template. And besides this, we want to say that we also want to pass the question ID to our URL of detail. Oh, sorry. I guess we need to have this quotes right over here because this URL needs to be rendered inside our templates. So again, let me reiterate what we have done is we are using our Django open and curly brackets along with our person symbol, which means that we want to process the code inside the curly brackets. And what we are doing is we are using a specific syntax called as URL. So what we want to do is we want to invoke a specific URL by the name of detail. Now this name of detail is coming from our URL files. Here we have specified the name as detail, and this is what we are referencing inside our HTML right over here. And our URL also needs to be passed the question ID, which is coming from right over here. Now this question is coming from our for loop that we have defined on line number 3. And we simply want to access the ID field out of our model of questions. Let me save this. Let us go back to our browser. Again, let us go back to our index page and let us see if it's working or not. So as you can see, everything is working fine. Now let us go back to the documentation and let us see what they are saying next. So they are saying that we have this view of details, and that's what they are putting inside the URL. So let us move on. And the next part is about namespacing your URLs. Now let me explain what they mean by the concept of namespacing. Let me open up my code editor and let us go back to the file of URLs. Now what happens is we have given a very specific name to our URLs called as index, detail, results and vote. But what happens if we have multiple applications with the same URL name? For example, we may have another application for our blog post, and we may have an index view for our blog post. At that time again Django will get confused. Should it call the index view from the polls application, or should it call index from our blog application? So in order to mitigate this confusion, what we can do is we can create another variable right over here. Now the name of the variable has to be very specific. The name has to be our app label, and in this case the name of our application is polls, so let us write the app label as polls. Now whenever we reference this index, we can be specific and we can say that first Django, I want you to go to my application of polls, and after that I want to use the URL or the view of index which is specific to just our polls application. Now let us go back to the documentation and let us see what's happening. So that's what they have done. They have created a variable called as app name. So just remember, the name of this variable is very important. And the next is they are showing how to reference that app name inside our URLs, inside our templates. Again, let us go back to our index.html. Inside my polls, this is the index.html. Now remember, a couple of minutes back we created this URL and we are saying that we want to reference a URL by the name of detail. But now we can be specific and we can tell to Django that I want you to go to my polls application, and from my polls application I want you to reference the details URL. So this is how it is written inside our Django templates. Let me save the file. Let us go back to our browser and let me refresh the page. Oops, so we have an error saying that polls is not a registered namespace. So let us go back to the URLs, and I think I know what I did. So this has to be app name, not app label. So now you know what happens if we get the name wrong. Let me save the file, and if I try to refresh, now everything is working fine. And I guess this is what we are supposed to cover in this part as well. So the next part I think we will start in the next video. The next part is I think working with forms, and I will catch you in the next one.